Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to Align's webinar on innovations in quantitative measurement of gender norms. Align's mandate is to synthesize and showcase learning and innovation related to gender norms, and as well as doing research ourselves on gender norms, a core part of our mandate is to be a platform for others to disseminate and amplify their work. Norms measurement isn't always glamorous, but it's very important. Without measuring norms, we don't know how they're changing, how far they're changing, what's driving that change, and how large those changes are. And today we're going to hear from people who've been quietly working away, developing innovative approaches to measuring change in gender norms. So I'm delighted to hand right over to our chair, Anita Raj, from the Emerge Initiative at the University of California at San Diego, who will be moderating and chairing today's session. Thank you, Anita.
Sorry, I always forget to mute. Welcome, everyone. I hope in whatever time zone you're in, you are ready for an interesting and illuminating discussion of norms, gender norms specifically. So as promised, we're going to be talking today about quantitative measurement of gender norms. What are they? How do we measure them meaningfully across issues and countries and populations? And what we're finding from the quantitative measures we have, how we can track change from on this work. I am part of something called the Emerge platform, and it is a platform that is designed to provide gender equality and empowerment measures as an open access resource for researchers. One of the things that has really been very demonstrable across areas, whether it's reproductive health or women's economic empowerment or maternal health, is that there are not the number of social norms measures that we want, and that when people are measuring social norms, they may be using different theoretical approaches in terms of what is a norm. Some people use it as the same as an attitude, and some people have we really moved the field away from that to recognize norms in their own right. So this is an amazing opportunity to hear from some of the most cutting edge work in the field right now to give us guidance on those theoretical underpinnings, the measures that are working in the field, and what we're finding across national context. We're going to have presentations from Alessia, Radice of UNICEF and Suruchi, Sood of Drexel to run a framework. We're going to hear a presentation from Rebecca Lyndgoh, Reye of Investing in Women Asia about survey research they've been doing in Asia. And we're going to hear from Rivera from UNDP on her multinational work to develop an index on gender norms that can help track change over time. So I'm very excited today to move right to our speakers so we can get to hear more about their work. And I'm going to start off with the presentation from Alessia Radice of UNICEF and Suruchi, Sood of Drexel. We're going to be presenting on their work that was conducted also with UNFPA on the ACT framework, a framework that was developed to guide measurement and help track social norms change on female genital mutilation. Over to you, Alessia and Suruchi. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anita, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As Anita mentioned, we're going to talk about the ACT framework, which is a macro-level M&E framework to measure FGM-related social norms change. So first of all, what is the ACT framework? A bit of background. This is a product that was developed by UNICEF and UNFPA joint program for the elimination of female genital mutilation. And it came from a realization of the limited availability of resources to track and monitor social norms change, and also to be able to track this change and link it to any programmatic interventions. So there was really a need for an evidence-based tool that can help us track social norms, but for this tool to also be standardized and practical and applicable to multiple contexts. So it's very important that we could find something that we could use across the different context of the joint program countries. So the long process of developing the ACT started in 2016 2016 with a desk review and a consultation with global experts to really try and define what should this act look like and what should it contain. We then went on to develop the conceptual model and the different tools and share them with regional experts. And then we adapted them and started piloting them between 2018 and 2019 in 2 countries, Guinea and Ethiopia. And these 2 countries were selected because they were contextually different and would allow us to really pilot and test the tools in 2 different contexts so that we could develop something that is adaptable to different contexts. We will understand more of the nuances between different contexts. Following those pre-testing and validations with the different experts within countries, we also had a global meeting in which we validated the tools, received feedback and adapted it and reviewed it one more time. So the tool is now being finalized. And I will just briefly mention what this tool contains and what it actually is. So the ACT framework is a conceptual framework that guides measurement of FGM-related social norms. It provides lists of indicators, both to monitor change and also to monitor interventions so that any change can be linked to those interventions. It comes with a set of tools, basically everything you need to implement the ACT. It's a set of tools, the structured interviews, the FGD guides, the interviews, the participatory approaches used for it, as well as guidance on how to implement it on the ground, together with all the templates that are required to implement it, from the TORs to recruit a research agency to the job descriptions for the data collectors. So it's a very comprehensive package, and I will now pass over to Suruchi to explain exactly what it is and how we came out with it. So over to you.
Thank you, Alessia. Let me start with sampling. So as Alessia mentioned, the validation was conducted in 3 regions of 2 countries, Ethiopia and Guinea. The total sample in each country for the pilot study was about 1,200 individuals. What we did was we interviewed 120 adolescent girls, and we interviewed their primary caregiver. So we had 120 primary caregivers. And we asked the adolescent girls and the caregivers to tell us about the community influentials as well as their social network contacts. And we then went ahead and interviewed 3 influential and 3 network contacts. And we gave preference to people who were mentioned more than once. And in addition to that, we did participatory research using in-depth interviews and focus group discussions. Let me just show you quickly our conceptual framework. Here's our broad conceptual framework. And so at one end, what we have is what people know, feel, and also social network and social support mechanisms. At the other end, we have social and behavior change. These factors feed into prevalent social norms, which are front and center in the model. And there are 2 additional aspects to this model. One is context, which is specifically looking at gender and power dynamics that influence all the other elements. And finally, communication approaches, which is the interventions that serve as a catalyst to diffusion of new ideas and new practices. We talked a little bit about the fact that we focused on triangulation of all the data and analysis. So instead of using a traditional question and answer format, the qualitative tools involved participatory activities. And these activities were designed to provide insights into specific indicators of the ACT framework. So here the indicators are laid out in rows, and the activities to measure these indicators are in the columns. So for example, a body mapping activity that asks participants to discuss what a girl undergoing cutting sees, smells, hears, thinks, and feels allows us to measure both awareness and knowledge about FGM. Beliefs about FGM are primarily measured through the free listing activity. And the strength of the qualitative methods, actually, what we realized was that if and when skillfully conducted, of course, they can yield information that cuts across indicators. So while the free listing was was primarily focused on looking at beliefs, we also were able to talk about beliefs or gain insights into belief through the body mapping, through the lifeline activity, through the vignettes. So, we really were able to get information from one technique on a variety of indicators. So essentially, as we mentioned before, the whole idea behind the ACT framework was designed to measure social norms, and we focused on descriptive norms. So what is it that others do? And we focused also on injunctive norms, which is what do others expect me to do? And these empirical and normative expectations are based on rewards and sanctions associated with a given behavior, or perceived rewards and sanctions. So in terms of the framework, we came up with the letters ACT, and the framework has 6 components, 2 under each of the letters A, C, and T. For this presentation, I'm going to focus really on the 2 specific components that deals with social norms as well as consider context. So the way we measure descriptive norms, we asked respondents using a 10-point scale where 10 is 0 and none is all, and we showed respondents 10 fingers, and we asked them, to what extent are girls in their community, women in their community cut? So how many approximately? And so they were able to choose any number between 0 and 10. And then based on the validation, we realized that this question needed to be disaggregated. And so we disaggregated it by girls 10 to 14 years old, girls 15 to 17-year-olds, and women. And additionally, we also asked respondents to recall how many people they knew personally who had decided to abandon FGM. And this question was helpful in looking at respondent perceptions about what is happening within their social networks vis-a-vis the practice of FGM. For injunctive norms, we asked respondents to report on the extent to which they felt that individuals in their social networks expected them to continue or abandon FGM. Respondents were asked to report on the extent to which their immediate family members, extended family members, friends and peers, community members, others in the community whose opinion mattered to them, what those people, all of them, expect them to do. Now, based on all of these questions, what we were able to do was to compute what we are calling a norm score. So what we did was we added the responses from the individual questions on descriptive and injunctive norms, and a higher number denoting a more positive norm. So this score, we feel, can allow us to measure changes over time or differences in norms by exposure to social and behavior change communication interventions.
Suruchi, sorry, we just have 1 more minute if you could wrap up. Thank you.
And we also measured benefits and sanctions. The important thing here was that what we realized was the identification of benefits and sanctions in terms of language was really difficult to do. So it's really important to pre-test all of our questions. We also looked at a qualitative way to measure norms, and what we did was we had participants respond to 2 questions to look at dissonance or concurrence between personal preferences and their perceptions and expectations. In terms of gender, what we had was 8 questions, and we did factor analysis, and these questions hung together in a single scale measure. And this allowed us to calculate, again, an average score for respondents in support of gender equality. And again, the qualitative activity that accompanied the gender scale was an activity called the gender boxes. And what this allowed us to do was examine expectations for both girls, women, and men. And the participants were encouraged to think about what are the ramifications if a man or a woman violates gender norms, right? So for example, what happens if a man marries an unkept woman? So I'm going to hand it over to Alessia to wrap this up. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So very quickly, I will briefly say how we hope to disseminate and support implementation of the Act. UNICEF UNICEF and UFBA will house all the tools in a website, and while these tools are to support UNJP United, the joint program countries, these are open to every other country, and yeah, the dissemination isn't entirely clear yet, but we will be supporting different countries from the joint program to implement this, and we will use the results to try and compare and also strengthen initiatives, because being able to link those results to implementation will allow us to identify what is working and what needs to be improved.
Thank you both so much. I think that this presentation really highlights the importance of clear theoretical underpinnings and definitions as we approach quantitative measurement, reminds us of the importance of engaging in qualitative and quantitative research, mixed methods research, to help guide the insight, and that value of triangulation and you know, creating a rigorous methodologic standard for the ways that we develop this work. And I really appreciate the emphasis on the participatory nature of the work, given the sensitivity of the issue and how context can really matter. So very exciting work. We look forward to seeing more of that as you start to disseminate. Let's move to our next presenter, and this is Rebecca Lyndgoh of Investing in Women Asia. She will be presenting findings from their online survey on gender norms with 6,000 urban millennials from across Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And these are very fresh data just from May 2020. So an exciting time to understand this in the midst of COVID, where we are worried about gender regression, gender norm regression happening. So Rebecca, over to you. Excited to hear about your presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Anita, and greetings, everyone. I hope today finds you and your loved ones safe and well. It's a privilege to be here with such a fantastic group of people who work on gender norms. Thank you to ODI for inviting Investing in Women to participate, and thank you to Katie Dietrich, who's on the line. She's the Vice President of Client Services at YouGov, and she's will be available to talk to us in the Q&A session today if you have any specific questions for YouGov on this survey work. So Investing in Women is an economic empowerment program that works in Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Myanmar. The program started in 2016 and is funded by the Australian government. Impact Investing works with local partners to support workplace gender equality in firms, impact investing into women's small and medium-sized enterprises, and innovative online and offline campaigns to influence gender norms. So Investing in Women contracted YouGov to run the Social Norms, Attitudes and Practices survey in May 2018 and again in May 2020, with 6,000 urban millennial men and women across Indonesia, the Philippines and Vietnam. In 2018, we focused the survey mainly on attitudes and behaviours. In 2020, Investing in Women had a shift towards a strategy addressing specific norms. So we built in a deeper level of social norms questions. Today's presentation will focus on the 2020 survey. The 4 norms we focused on were Norm 1, the expectation on women to be primary carers. Norm 2, the expectation on men to be primary breadwinners. Norm 3, the belief that there are some jobs better suited to men and others better suited to women. And Norm 4, the perception that at work, men make better leaders and women better supporters. Based on social norms literature, we developed this gender norms framework to help us design the survey. We particularly drew upon the work of Christina Bihiero's Social Norms and Social Change courses, CARE's Social Norms Analysis Plot, which has been used in Vietnam, and Oxfam's We Care work in the Philippines. You will see that the top row in orange focuses on the individual. When individual attitudes lead to individual behaviours, these are called independent motivations. You may know of many awareness campaigns that focus on the simple formula. We also recognise in something as complex as gender norms, there are often social expectations that act as barriers to behaviour change. So we added in that second row in the green of the collective. So these are the normative expectations, empirical expectations, and the sanctions of if people are going to be criticised if they change their behaviour. So these are identified here as interdependent motivations. So when you factor in the individual and collective elements that may influence someone's behaviour, it can get quite complex. But we simplified the task and made a consistent set of questions to cover these factors. Here's the set of questions we used. The orange questions 1 and 4, what do you think and what do you do, cover the individual elements. These questions were asked in both 2018 and 2020 surveys. The green questions there are the collective elements, and we added them in the 2020 survey. So not only did we use this framework to design the survey, but we also used it to test the results. We asked urban millennials why they behave the way they do. Was it their own beliefs that led to their behaviour, or was it the beliefs of others? At a first glance, looking at the raw data, many said it was their own personal choice and beliefs that led to their behaviour, as if it was a I think, therefore I do, conscious decision kind of thing. However, when YouGov ran a regression analysis using various models to compare lots of data points, the results showed this. Pretty much we're all sheep. That is, we're inclined to follow the crowd. What we see matters. What I think rarely leads to what I do. What others think often correlates with what I think. What others do often correlates with what I do. On top of that, media was also a strong influencer on what I do. This is good news for our campaign partners using social media to reach millions. It's extra good news that even during a lockdown, media can still be used to influence behaviour. If we're going to influence gender equality, our strongest tool will be demonstrating it. In the 2020 survey, we included some questions around COVID-19 impacts. Results from the survey in Vietnam showed households that share roles coped better. Compared to their counterparts that keep traditional roles at home, women from households that share childcare were 11% less likely to report feeling childcare pressure due to COVID impacts, and men from households that share breadwinning were 21% less likely to report feeling income-generating pressure. The survey results show that gender equality at home is on the rise. We asked urban millennials when growing up who did most of the childcare and income earning in their home. These are the bars listed as previous generation. We then looked at the data from those who have dependent children. These are the current generation bars. For millennials who don't have partners or children yet, we asked them to reflect on what they'd like to do in the future. These are listed as future generation. This graph is from the Philippines and shows that from one generation of parents to the next, equality is on the rise. This is especially so for the orange columns of sharing childcare. While sharing breadwinning in the purple columns is also on the rise, it lags compared to the equality shifts for childcare. In the Philippines, 52% of men want to share breadwinning with their future partner, compared to 81% of women. Similar trends were seen in Vietnam and Indonesia, with income earning seen as an important part of manhood. In the Institute of Social Development Studies in Vietnam, which was conducted just recently, it's worth considering how campaigns are addressing norm 2 of breadwinning. Indeed, the interconnected nature of the norms, with norm 2 may slow down the momentum of the other norms if it's not addressed. What people see in their workplace matters. Workplaces that demonstrate equality also influence the personal attitudes of their employees. Let's take this example from Indonesia. Look at the 2 bars in the middle of the graph. These are respondents who work in companies where women and men are equally represented in leadership, or where women hold most of the leadership positions. The height of the bars shows the responses that favour gender equality. The height of the orange bar shows how many respondents disagree with the statement, men make better leaders than women. The height of the purple bar shows how many respondents said they had no personal preference for a male boss. Now let's look at the orange and purple bars on the left-hand side. These respondents work in companies dominated with male leaders. You can see they're less likely to have responses that favour gender equality. A similar phenomena was seen in other countries, with those witnessing gender equality and leadership at work more likely to hold attitudes that support gender equality. Recognising urban millennials are not a homogeneous group, YouGov ran a cluster analysis looking at the responses of women and men in each country and produced this segmentation. The shading shows how traditional the segment is. The darker the shading, the more traditional. The lighter the shading, the more progressive. You can see that Vietnam holds the largest progressive segments, followed by the Philippines and then Indonesia. The benefit of understanding these segments is that partners can better understand the possible inroads to build on when influencing a group of urban millennials. For example, take the top left-hand circle with the light-shaded segment called Neutral Leaning Progressive on Leadership that forms 23% of urban millennial women in Indonesia. These women are more likely to have traditional views of gender roles at home, but more open to views on equality at work. This group may be more receptive to messages about equality around childcare if it is linked to messages on equality in workplace leadership, the latter of which is something they are already supportive of. The analysis also showed us who may be the gatekeepers, the ones dishing out criticism that keep people following traditional norms. For example, urban millennial mothers in several traditional leaning and neutral segments in Indonesia and Vietnam showed a desire for greater equality in childcare at home, but worry about criticism from their partners. In Vietnam, these women also worried about criticism from their in-laws. We won't go into the detail of the segments today, but if you're interested, there's more detail in the reports on Investing in Women's website. And this is my last slide here. We're encouraging our campaign partners to drive home the message, there is more equality out there than you think. Survey respondents consistently overestimated the amount of traditional behaviour going on in households and workplaces. This graph from the Philippines shows approximately 80% of respondents think most homes have women primarily doing childcare at home, whereas only 47% of women said this was the case in their own home. In social norms language, we call this pluralistic ignorance, where the majority of the population thinks something's happening when it's actually not. The awesome thing about this is that it provides a great springboard for gender equality campaigns and activities. Expose the equality that is already happening in homes and workplaces, and more people will start to behave with equality too. Linking this back to the first insight we shared with you, what we see matters. There's lots of opportunities for partners to positively shift gender norms by amplifying the equality that is already happening. We have this exciting job of working with partners over the next 3 years as they design, launch, measure the impact of their campaigns. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. That was a really illuminating presentation. I think that it was really helpful to see how you were able to apply these notions of injunctive norms and descriptive norms into the survey. I also think that the elements of what you were able to capture in terms of, we often think of gender equality as benefiting women and girls, and to really highlight that sharing the burden actually benefits all. I think it's a really important message, and let us not forget that there's more equality out there than we think. A lot of the social norms literature is finding that the norms are predicting more than the individual attitudes. And that is a really exciting finding for us to start using. So it's a really great presentation. Thank you so much. Let's all take that one home, that there's more equality out there than you think there is. I, in America, really need to know that right now. All right, so now what I'd love to do is turn it over to Carolina. Carolina Rivera is from UNDP, and she will be presenting on their development of Social Norms Index, which they released in 2020 under a report called Tackling Social Norms, to be able to understand and track these changes at a national level based on existing survey research from the world, largely from the World Values Survey. Carolina, I just welcome, and please, handing off to you.
Thank you. So the work I'm going to present for you today started with the Human Development Report of 2019. So we developed this index for that report, but later on, early this year, in March of 2020, we published the whole database for the gender index. So the inspiration to do this index was that we were looking at the Gender Inequality Index and how it was showing slowing progress towards the years. And in the 2019 report, we developed this idea of having basic and enhanced capabilities. When we are referring to basic capabilities, we were thinking about participation of women in primary education, participation of women in the economy, and the ability to vote. So in these two graphs, you can see how the gap, the global gender gap, in the case of basic, in this side I'm referring to politics. So women are able now to vote, but when you go to more enhanced abilities which refer to greater empowerment, then women are underrepresented. If we look at the speakers of the parliament and women's in head of the government. If we look at the economic dimension, the same is happening. So the gap is lower when we look at employees, but then the gap goes greater when we look at women in top positions. So we were wondering why this was happening, and then we came with the idea that social norms were one of the main factors explaining this, and that's why we decided to build this index. So the index has 4 dimensions: political, educational, economic, and physical integrity. And it uses 7 different indicators. For the case of the educational dimension, is the only one that we just have 1 indicator. In the case of political, we have if men make better political leaders than women do, and if women should have the same rights as men. In the case of educational, we take into account if people think if university is more important for a woman than for a man. In the case of economic, we're considering also the part of leadership, if men make better business executives than women do, and if men should have more right to a job than women. And in physical integrity, we take 2 proxies, a proxy for intimate partner violence and a proxy for reproductive rights. The objective of the Gender Social Norms Index was to provide a global sense of the biases and to see if there was a backlash in attitudes towards gender equality. And it was also to serve as an advocacy tool for countries to shed light in the need to address discriminatory norms and beliefs. So to do this, we needed a global survey, and that's why we decided to use the World Values Survey. So in the advantages of using this type of instrument, we see first that it was a global survey of perceptions and values. So we have representation for the whole world, and it was also at the same time nationally representative for each country. But the other side is that it does not consider different cultural differences between and within the countries. So as my other colleagues have presented for country examples, this is not something that will be allowed with this survey. The kind of tables that we're presenting in the publication and in the results follow this structure. So I just wanted to show you because I think this is a really useful tool for people to use in their presentations and in the work you are doing, so you can understand what we're presenting in each of them. So in the first one, we have the results for the Social Norms Index, and we present 2 different indices. One with the share of people with at least 1 bias, one with the share of people with at least 2 biases, and then the share of people with no bias against gender equality. And then we present the share of people in the different dimensions of the index. On the second table, we have the same results, but divided by gender for men and women. And on the third table, we present trends. And on the fourth table, we have trends by gender. It is important to know that on the first 2 tables, we are presenting data for the last year available, which is about for 75 countries that represent 81% of the world's population. And in the case of the time trends, we are presenting it for 31 countries, which is about 59% of the world's population. So I'm gonna go into the results that we find with this index. So globally, 88% of men and women show at least 1 bias, while 12% showed no bias against gender equality. And if we go into the particular indicators, 47% of the global level think that men make better political leaders than women. 41% think men are better business executives than women, and 28% still think it is okay for a man to beat his wife or partner. So if we disaggregate this by gender, we can see that 91% of men show some kind of bias, and only 9.4% of men have no bias. And in the case of women, 86% of women show some kind of bias, and only 13.9% don't show bias. This was actually a striking finding for us because we we actually thought the percentage of women showing bias against gender equality was going to be lower than what we found. So when we see these results for the different time frames, so the World Values Survey present results in waves of 5 years. We are looking at the last 2 waves, which is wave 5 and wave 6. Wave 5 goes from 2004 to 2009, and wave 6 from 2010 to 2014. We can see how the percentage of people with at least some bias has grown higher in both men and women, as well as the percentage of people with moderate to intense bias. That will mean at least 2 biases. So even though the changes are really small, between 1% and 3%, we're seeing the evidence of a backlash. It is important to know that the World Values Survey has just published the new data from, I think it was July, and we are working already on that. So in this new wave that is going to go from 2015 to 2020, we're expecting to see actually that backlash reverse and maybe see some progress as the results that were presented before for the different countries in Asia. So if we look at the different results for countries, we can see that the progress in the share of men and women with no gender social norm bias, the ones in the top show larger progress for men and women. So in the case of men, we can see Chile, Australia, the US, Netherlands, and Argentina. And in the case of women, Netherlands, Chile, Australia, and China. And we can see a backlash in the ones that have that you have down the screen, which is Sweden, Germany, India, Mexico. And in the case of women, Sweden, India, South Africa, and Romania. So this was striking also, especially for Sweden. And we actually had a specific note for that country. I have 2 country examples, and one of those is Sweden, because what happened with Sweden is that it came from a very high percentage of people with no bias. As you can see, from 2005 to 2009, it had 81% of people that had no bias against equality. So then the fall was bigger in comparison to other countries. But if you still compare the last period results from Sweden with other countries, it's still at the top. It means it has a greater percentage of population with no bias. And then we can also analyze the data across the different dimensions of the index. So as you can see here, if we go in any dimension, the bias of men is higher than the bias of women. And the highest difference is in the economic dimension. And then we can analyze the case of Chile, which is in the opposite. It was one of the countries that improved the most. So as you can see, the amount of people with no bias increased from one wave to another. And we can also see that the levels in compared to Sweden are way lower. Sorry, are way higher for the percentage of people biased. And then you can see the higher differences are also in the economic dimension and in the political dimension. And this can be a useful tool for pointing out countries where should they be intervening in terms of social norms.
Carolina, just 1 more minute, sorry.
Yes, yeah, I'll wrap it up. Thank you. So, and what we did at the end was try to relate how the gender social norms index related to different inequality indices. So as we were expecting, when we have a higher bias, a higher gender social norms index, then we have also higher gender inequality. And when we have a higher gender social norms index, we have a higher time spent in unpaid domestic chores. So the key messages of this publication were gender equality and women's rights have had progress, but this is slowing down. Gender gaps are closing mainly for basic capabilities, but they are growing for enhanced capabilities where more empowerment is involved. And social norms and attitudes are one of the major obstacles for this equality and empowerment. And the backlash against women's rights is becoming stronger. So this is why we must act now for norms to be shifted towards gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was really informative and I think very helpful to remind us why it's so important to have some harmonized measures across countries so that we can do indices like this. It's really helpful to understand how nations compare to each other and how we're tracking that over time. And so while it's so valuable to have context-specific measures, it's equally valuable to be able to capture this kind of information at the national scale. I think we can all leave your presentation feeling deeply disturbed by the fact that we are seeing an increase in backlash. And I think beyond that, you know, because we're hearing that that's even become worse in the context of COVID, and these data were from before that, I think this is going to be something we're going to have to watch very carefully. I know that in the United States, for example, women are losing their jobs more and are less likely to even consider going back into the workplace, particularly mothers with young children who are contending with trying to manage school from home for their kids. So I think it's a really important time that we be reflecting on these issues. And I think, you know, really want to commend UNDP because it was a forward-thinking idea to do this, and it's going to be all the more important to see the coming year of data and what that will bring. Okay, thank you. The presentations were wonderful. Our rhythm was very good, and we have some really good questions at hand. So I'd like to thank the presenters, and move on to questions, unless the presenters have any other points or comments that they want to be able to make at this time. Anybody? Okay, so I'm going to move on to questions. Sorry. Sometimes I'm trying to get to the chat. For everybody in the audience, I want to encourage you to please continue to provide your questions. We'll do our best to get through them. All right, so this I'm going to give to Alessia and Suruchi. Given the robust research processes required, which seem to often rely on, quote, experts, what good participatory research methodologies designed and led by reference groups themselves have been tried? That's quite a complex question. I don't know, Suruchi and Alessia, you want to try to tackle that? Without writing a full report, because that's a big one.
Sure. So the purpose of this work was really to create the most viable tools, right, that we could use. What we've also done is, once the report is released, you'll notice we've provided very sort of step-by-step instructions on how somebody who's working at the ground level, at the community level, can use these methods, and not just for implementing them, but also what kinds of information can one glean from these methods. And we usually refer to them as behavioral monitoring, and to the extent possible, we're going to try to integrate them into the programming itself. So this isn't going to be research that's done separately from program implementation, but more program implementation that has also a research role. Thank you.
Muted, sorry. Rebecca, I believe this next question would best be suited for you. Another question is about intergenerational change in social norms, which seems vital. What approaches to measuring change on longer timescales are out there? I love this. Hashtag gender norms from this question, person who sent the question. You had some interesting data on this intergenerational change. Can you respond?
Yeah, so when we asked the survey questions, we knew we really wanted to ask about the family of origin to test to see. We had a bit of a theory that perhaps millennials that grew up in households that shared might more equally share themselves. So we had that, and then we also had questions for, well, what about those people that don't have partners or children yet? And so that was a separate set. So I think it was more in the analysis stage that we thought, well, let's try and compare these against each other and see if they're changing. And, you know, we recognize that aspirations don't always result in reality. Once someone gets married and they decide if they're going to, or partnered and decide if they're going to share childcare or not, that, you know, might be a different thing in reality. But so that's a bit of the the background, how we came up with that. It's a good question around, in different countries, are we tracking that? I might throw it to some of my other friends on the panel. Is anyone aware of such studies being done?
So I wanted to add something, given like the World Value Survey is using different waves to apply the different questions. So one reason why we chose those questions to elaborate the index was for them to be available in most of the years, to be able to analyze the different waves. So in some point, we want to do it also backwards, because the World Value Survey started in 1981, I think it's the first wave. But also one problem that we faced is we wanted to have the data disaggregated by age to see also these differences. But as you disaggregate more, then you lose more sample, and then it's harder for the results to be significant. So that's why we didn't present the results by age. So this is something to consider.
Caroline, we at Emerge have had the opportunity to work with the World Values Survey, and we have been able to support them in a new measure that they've tried out in Ethiopia, and they've tried it in Zimbabwe, and they're going to be trying it out in some other countries. And that one is actually going to be on these norms questions. Because largely this is attitudes, and then in the aggregate, we might conceptualize most norms, but it's going to be on women's economic empowerment. And, again, we had no idea COVID was going to hit, but this is going to be a pretty pressing issue. So we look forward to that. And I think it speaks to the fact that we need to get, and we've been seeing this a lot with the Emerge review of the large-scale survey measures, DHS, LSMS, that, there's a lot of attitudinal measures, but we need to be putting in more of the norms measures. And I also want to put a plug in for doing more on sanctions and backlash, more directly assessed, because I think that that's an area that we could grow our measures. Carolina, this next question is for you. Is there a reason why there is only one indicator for the education dimension and two for the other dimensions?
So the reason was mainly data availability. As I was saying before, we chose the different indicators depending if it had representation in the whole different waves. So for education, we only found that one. I know that the new wave that came out in 2020 has also new questions. So that's also something to be considered.
All right. So this next question, I think, is one that any of you can answer, and so maybe more than one of you might want to. On one hand, we talked about gender norms being more equitable than we think our individual attitudes. On the other hand, we heard that gender bias is on the rise. How do we explain these changes? Carolina, that also might be coming a little bit from your presentation.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning when I presented the results, I think part of it's because the last wave we have finished in 2014. So probably when using the new wave that accounts for 2015 to 2020, we're gonna see less of a backlash. I don't know if that answers the question.
Does anyone else? I think so. Does anyone else want to add?
This is Katie, and we managed running the survey on the YouGov side, and I think we're looking at different things where Rebecca's survey was looking at this intergenerational change and asking people to think back over many years. And then the World Values Survey has this other great benefit of being able to be stable across waves and to be able to check minutely in between the years. So we didn't have the benefit of, having like the stability of wording to be able to compare to recent years.
Thank you, Katie. And I was remiss in not recognizing you at the start, Katie Dietrich from YouGov, who worked with Rebecca on the survey in across those 3 Asian countries. All right, this is a question for Carolina. It would be great to learn more about the gender index methodology, and Well, this was already done by the one educational thing, but a little bit more on the methodology would be great.
So the methodology that we use for the results presented is a basic index count, but we also did a different index to separate it by dimension with the methodology used by the multidimensional poverty index, which is the Alkire-Foster. If you have more specific questions, I can just leave my email and you can write directly to me. And we also have online FAQs document that talks about more in depth of the methodology.
So, and this relates to that same question, I think, how it can be applied to GSRI, the Gender Sensitive Resilience Index that has been adopted in FAO. If the person who shared that question could provide a link to the survey, maybe that's to the FAO index, we can try to share that with our attendees. But Caroline, if you could respond to that. The Gender Sensitive Resilience Index adopted in FAO.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this index, but I'm guessing that the social norms index can be used to reference to countries, and maybe the world value survey can be used. Maybe they can use one part of the survey or select some questions to incorporate in their methodology.
Another question that I think really everybody might have good responses to this. I think this is something we all struggle with. We've talked about looking at disaggregated data, sex disaggregated data, to better understand variations in gender norms. However, these conversations primarily refer to quote men and quote women as the two definite categories. What about people who have other sex or gender identities? Are their identities erased in quantitative research even when talking about challenging the norm? Good question. Thoughts?
Yeah, so when we designed the 2020 survey, we wanted to make sure that we encompassed people identifying as the gender that they identify with. And I think for us with doing the analysis, the challenge was having a large enough sample size to be able to, make conclusions from. So I'm not sure, Kate, if you would have more to add about the, what we try to do that way. But at the end of the day, we've mainly analysed people that identified as male and people that identified as female.
Yeah, so the gender question that we asked allowed people to self-identify, and we followed up with several questions if they did. I think about gender roles in their partnerships and things. In the end, we reached, a certain number of self-identifying male and females, and we kind of left those non-binary folks outside of the weighting scheme. Although we have the data to review as well, but they didn't have the very in-depth questions, which I think we're asking kind of about societal expectations of kind of in traditional relationships.
I just want to add that I think this is just a general struggle as we seek to have, let's say, nationally representative research to be able to have the kinds of representation of some of the most marginalized groups. And so absolutely this includes sexual and gender minorities, but it can also include ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And I think this is really just something that we have to contend with as researchers who want to have the nationally representative data. But I think that it really is upon us also to ensure that there are some population-specific surveys placed out there, because we are in a position in the United States where we're doing this, where we probably have a greater number of, relative to some other nations that might identify as transgender or not cis male or cis female, and we didn't have the numbers either. So I think this is just a struggle we have. We have the same issue with even American Indian, Native American populations. This is a comment, not a question, but I think it's an important one. I actually agree with this comment. I think some of us have been saying this. I don't think the New World Values Survey will show a decline in gender equality backlash, but instead the contrary. New surveys, including European Barometer on Values, show increased backlash, particularly in Central and Eastern European countries. Katie, I don't know if you have any background. I happen to know about a survey YouGov did with Georgetown on political idea, the notions around women in political leadership or participation, and we are definitely seeing an increase in conservative attitudes that really took me aback. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Katie, or if you know of that survey. It's a big group.
No. Yeah, no. Is it international?
No, it's the United States, and it was yeah.
Oh, okay.
But so we're seeing it in the data coming out from Europe and the data coming out from the United States, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, occurring to this attendee. And so, yeah, this is something to watch. So we have a point raised, interesting point about the regional barometer surveys that can be another source of insight on how norms are changing. So this is a really important thing. Rachel, you have a good question for Suruchi and Alessia, and I'm wondering if you would be able to say it, because I think you might be able to give more background on the methodology you're speaking of regarding holding up fingers. So I'm going to hand that statement off to you.
Okay. Sure. So thank you so much for asking that question. This is something we were really cognizant about, that we were dealing with a particular group of people who may or may not be able to, for example, talk about in terms of a proportion, because the questions for the finger scale was what proportion of girls in your community are cut. And so we actually tried a variety of different ways to do this. And we, pre-tested our tools over and over again. Originally, we had wanted to do a 7-point scale, and we had used a ladder. But we then realized that using the fingers actually really worked out very well, because it was really easy for people to conceptualize, something in terms of they holding their hands up. And so it's like, oh, okay, 4 out of 10. So it was actually worked out really, really well. And we also, I should mention, have a variety of other simple ways to ask questions, which are, so we also used a color-coded scale, for example, where we have, strongly agree is green, and then we moved to red, and then we had to change some of the colors because of where the countries we were in. So, we tried very many different things. Some worked better than others, and, so that's pretty much it. Yeah. So I'm a big believer actually in using these ways to make sure that your questions are understandable to the wide variety, and pre-test the questions over and over again to make sure that we're getting the answers that we really want, and not just coming up with questions that feel good to us. So.
Can I add, Anita, to that? Thank you, Suruchi. Also, in the pre-testing, we found that using words had some difficulties in different languages, in different contexts. So saying very likely, unlikely, very unlikely were terms that were quite difficult to translate. So having more visual cues proved more helpful. So that's really how we create. And then the happy faces, the smiley faces, much more visual approaches that are more easily transferable to different contexts.
I just love the innovations in methodology that you're bringing to the table, and I think it really challenges us to not assume that what we have in hand is the best way to get the response we want, and that we really need to be thinking about how to make, we can still do harmonized measures, but using some of these visual response patterns. Okay, so another question. In continuation of my question about binary gender identities, do the panelists feel that questions about relationships when talking about social norms, for example, expectations of women from husbands, are also heteronormative, with an assumption of heterosexual relationships being the norm at home. I think this is getting at something that I think, again, is a challenge for us, really we need to challenge ourselves with as individuals and research groups doing this work, which is, do the ways we ask these questions reinforce the norms that we are actually that are actually impeding gender equality, and gender equality with considerations of a broader definition of what is gender, what is sex, what is sexual identity, what is gender identity. So thoughts from people.
Yes, I want to come up like from the side of the World Value Survey. Even when I was presenting results for the variable of if someone thinks it's justifiable for a man to beat his wife, I think that's very heteronormative. And if you look at other questions of the World Value Survey, for example, if being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay, just using the word housewife, I think it's very heteronormative and traditional, and maybe we should be thinking more about changing this wording when we ask the question. So I agree with what you were saying.
I have one that is my pet peeve that I got out of a survey I was working on recently, and it was a point of pride. It's the one where they ask, and it's still heteronormative, but and I need to work on helping support consideration of that piece, but it was the one about husbands who, quote, help their wives with childcare or domestic labor. Like, why is that help for me? That's obviously an individual issue that I need to be working on as well. So great points. Okay, another one. Oh, this is a great question for us. Why do panelists think the field of research into gender norms, into social norms, not just gender norms, is largely comprised of women? Great question. Rachel, I actually want you to also think about answering this one as sort of the person who brought us together. So what are people's thoughts? I think everyone should get the chance to answer this one. So we can, I'm just going to go across my board. Katie, what do you think?
Well, I'm the non-gender norms expert here, so I'm not as familiar with the composition. And I guess it's luck of the draw that I am the female representative here from the Research Institute. Could have been a man. So I'm actually very curious to hear from the experts on this.
Okay, Alessia, remember that this is about research into social norms, not just gender norms. Why is it mostly women?
That's a good question. I don't think I have an answer to it. I don't know. Why is it mostly women? It's not just women. We know that there are also men working in this area. Why is it mostly women? I don't know if anyone has some insights into this. Maybe because we feel more affected by it. I don't know.
So
I don't know.
One reason could be because it's also a function of the fields that we come from. At least in public health, the majority of the people working in public health tend to be women. And so I wonder if some of it is just related to the backgrounds that we bring in. If you look at schools of public health in terms of MPH programs or PhD programs, the proportion of women in those schools is always significantly higher than men. So that might be one reason, that it's not so much that women are attracted to social norms fields, but more that, there are more women working in these issues to begin with. So I'm not sure it's, yeah, I mean, to me, I think it might just be something as simple as that.
Which begs the question, why are more women working in public health than men? But, Rebecca, thoughts?
I thought Suruchi had a good hypothesis there, so I will leave it.
Carolina?
I think it's the field, but maybe it's also what Alessia was saying first, that it's more relatable to us, and maybe it's not, I don't know, as relatable to men. But my co-author in the work I'm doing is a man, so that's someone else working on social norms. But yeah, I don't have another explanation.
All right, Rachel, give us the answer.
I don't have an answer either, but I did want to say that in some ways, this panel, although it's entirely composed by women, is actually challenging a social norm and stereotype that of statistics, at least historically, having been much more of a men's field. And, perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, you wouldn't have expected to see a panel talking about quantitative approaches that was entirely women. Whether that's right or wrong is another question. But anyway, I think it is looking at a change in norms about the kinds of fields that girls want to go into, feel they can go into, and that women have opportunities to go into and excel in when they're in the workplace.
I think this is going to relate to the next question, but I don't know what came first, the norms that we focus upon or the issues arise that we realize we need to bring norms into. But a lot of this work has focused on things like female genital mutilation, reproductive health, violence against women. And so those have been issues that women relative to men may have more interest in just because of the nature of the issue at hand. And that brings us to an additional question. In addition to the kind of words we use to frame question, it also matters what questions are asked of him. For example, are we only asking women about their experience of violence, and are we only asking men about their perpetration of violence? It's an interesting question because we know the numbers go in one direction, but by doing so, do we inadvertently normalize it? That last piece was mine, but thoughts from the panel? Would anyone like to take that question?
I'll take it. I think when we built our 2020 survey, we were quite conscious of making sure we asked the same question no matter what gender the person identified as. So I think it's important for a point of comparison as well, because I looked at other surveys while we were designing it, thinking, oh, that's an interesting insight for women, but it doesn't have a comparison stat for men. So how do we know, how much, what's going to be the real difference there? So I think, yeah, we really tried to make sure that if we were asking a question around childcare or around breadwinning, leadership, etc., we made sure the question wording was the same.
And I just want to point out one interesting factor from our work in Ethiopia, both in Ethiopia and Guinea. We were trying really hard to make sure that we had these questions, and we are asking all the questions to both men and women. And it was really a struggle for our data collectors and our local research partners, because they were like, these questions are not going to make any sense to the people we're talking to. And so it took us quite a while to kind of sort of really work on just the people who were involved in the research and say, well, let's go ahead and ask the question, because unless we ask them, we won't really know what people know and how people feel and what they believe. And so I think that's something also to be kept in mind, sort of the biases that we all walk into a situation with. So.
And on that note, that brings us to an additional question that I think is important for us to respond to. Why is it only women in social, in addition to why it's only women in social norms research, would also like to highlight that although we've been talking about a lot of developing country context today, this panel consists mostly of white women based in the West, global North. 2 of us are South Asian, I guess. This is a challenge. I think representation is a challenge. So I will speak to this, and then everyone can add, because it's a really hard question to tackle. There is no doubt that the opportunity to conduct research is a position of privilege, and it's position of privilege and quantitative research at a different level, because quite frankly, oftentimes that is more lucrative. And it has taken, I think, quite a while for women to be, as Rachel pointed out, for women to be at the table in these ways. I mean, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Medicine, and there's a point where you are supposed to vote on like the assistant professors, the associate professors, the full professors. And at that time, when you vote for the assistant professors, all the assistant professors have to leave, and it's just the associate and full. And once you get to voting on the associate professors, all the people that are not full professors have to leave. And I remember the first time I was at this meeting, and I'm in California, which is, you know, in a fairly, I would say, progressive environment. And I just watched. I'm in the fortunate position to be a tenured faculty, full professor. I just watched as all the other women left. And so, you know, I think it's really important to represent the diversity, and it takes time. And we need to see reflection of a broader group at the table. But at the same time, can we take just a moment and appreciate that we as women got here, because it wasn't so freaking easy. So it's in no way to take away from the fact that this is just inadequate representation. We should have the nations that we reflect in our study, that natives of those nations be presenting on the findings, or the regions of the world. For all that I'm South Asian, I was born and raised in this country, and certainly that afforded me a certain kind of opportunity to be positioned in some of this global work. So this doesn't take away from that, but, you know, let's just also recognize this as a step forward, and value that, and say, you know, given that it's a step forward for gender equality, and then say, yeah, our work is not nearly done. Does anyone else have thoughts to add to that? So I have another question, but I think this is Carolina. We don't know the gender sensitivity resilience index, and again, please do share the link to that if you have it. But also the gender equality marker, GEM. I think there's an interest in how your norms index relates to these. So I don't know if you can comment on the gender equality marker, GEM.
So maybe I can comment from the work we're doing forward in the office in general in gender equality. So we have a gender inequality index, and we are having different meetings to either continue with this index and modify it, or generate a new index. And we have been working with different institutions, with UN Women, I think with the OECD, and they also present the different measures they have, and we are considering having a social norms component into the inequality indices. So I think this is a work in progress. I don't think right now it has a relation with the gender equality marker or the other sensitive resilience index, but this is something that has to be talked and continue working on it. I don't know if that helps.
All right, so I have, I'm a little, we can take in more questions. We're out of the questions from the field, but I was going to see Rachel, as somebody who's been, you know, having the opportunity to listen to all of these presentations. I was curious, do you have any questions for our panelists with a broader focus on what Align is getting done in this area?
Thanks, Anita. I mean, perhaps since we're at 3:15 now, this is, rather than me ask more questions, it's an opportunity perhaps for any of the panel to share any further thoughts that you would like to. You know, we kept you very strictly to time in your 10 minutes at the beginning, and I'm sure there's much more that you all might like to say, given the opportunity which is now arising.
So I can jump in and start. I do think that it's really, really critical to make sure that we're using mixed methodologies. For the longest time, we've assumed that if it isn't measured quantitatively, it's actually not being measured at all. And I think that's a big learning for us in our work, just how to make sure that you're putting the two together. Because the kind of nuances that we were able to get for, able to measure social norms qualitatively, for example. So we had these 2x2 tables where we ask people, you know, what would you do and what would others expect you to do? And we ask them both the questions and then they give us the answers. And it's fascinating to see, not just for us, but even for people to visually be able to map where they fall. And then you ask them, well, what are the reasons for this particular, you know, why are you in this particular box? And you can just see people sort of thinking about it in of themselves, like going, wait a minute, why am I in that box? And, you know, really sort of looking down into the reasons. So I've always been a quantitative researcher, but I think over the last 10 years or so, the more I engage with the more participatory methods, the more I think we get robust and richer data. So that's, I think, a point I really, really wanted to make. And the second point I want to make is, you know, the importance of keeping context in mind. One of our biggest learnings, I think, was around language. How I say something in English and somebody says it in French, but then how it's going to get translated into Amharic or, you know, one of the local languages. That's the part I feel like oftentimes get left behind a little bit. And I think that's really, really critical. So for our study, I remember what we ended up doing was creating these multilingual glossaries, and they ran pages and pages and pages. But, you know, I think that's really important, that whole notion of what you're asking and how does it translate into somebody's local language, and the importance of making sure that your questions are indeed asking or mean the same thing that you mean them to mean for the person you're talking to. So I think those two things have been my biggest learning from this entire, you know, 6-year process, if you will. Yeah, thank you.
I want to, I think we can potentially close with remarks from Rachel, but I want to ask one thing of our audience before we go. I think that, you know, and speaking to this notion of being participatory, I think we should leave on the note of how we can make representation better. So if there were people that could provide thoughts on how we can have better representation, and I don't want people to feel limited. You know, you can start from anywhere from we have to improve our universities in our country, in a given country, to we need to make quota systems. It doesn't matter. But if people could share that, I think that's something that we would all benefit from hearing, to think about how to increase our representation. Because with the representation, we gain better perspective, interpretation, better measures, and certainly that's demonstrated by the diversity of contexts and disciplines that are represented in this panel. So as people consider putting that information in, I want to take the time to thank the speakers, and Rachel, also to thank you. It was a wonderful opportunity to chair. And I hope I can do this again. Wonderful, always wonderful to work with Align. And handing off to you for closing comments for us.
Well, thank you so much, Anita. And on behalf of Align, I would once again like to thank all the panelists very much for all the insights that you shared with us today, and to thank the audience for the very interesting and challenging questions that you've put. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And as I really appreciate Anita's call for comments and suggestions on this very important issue of improving representation as well. Over the next couple of months, Align will be expanding and boosting the part of its website that focuses on data tools and measurement. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our mandate is very much about being a place for people to share and amplify their work. So if you've got materials around tools and measurement, or indeed any other topic to do with gender norms that you would like to share with us, then please do contact us via the Align inbox, which there are lots of ways on the site to contact us, and we've got the Twitter handle up, and you know, we really would be delighted to showcase your work. On this slide, we've got a few of all the panelists have put together some leads and resources based on the presentations they made today and other key resources. So these are all additional places to look for further detail. We'll have the recording of the webinar up on the Align platform within the next few days, and so this slide will be at the end of it. So once again, I would like to thank everybody for taking the time to take part in this webinar today. We hope you found it useful and stimulating, and we really hope to hear from you and to build the Align platform further with all your insights. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.